December 13th, 1917 would be a fateful day in the life of HoW William Leadbetter, better known as Leadbelly. That day, HoW, along with Eric Griffin, Will Stafford, and Lee Brown, were on their way to a dance at the Red River Bottoms. A woman had come between HoW and Will, and the situation was tense, to put it mildly. It didn't make matters any easier that Will's wife was HoW's cousin. Nor did it ease tensions that Will's nickname for his wife was Pig. On top of this new woman, who was the main reason for the tension between the two men, was living with Will and his wife in this complex saga. Like in a Greek tragedy, the night seemed destined to end in similar fashion. But from tragedy and hardships would arise one of HoW's most well-known songs. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, musicians, and trouble. I am your host, Jason Nemore Harden, inviting you to join us as we explore the troublesome life of Leadbelly and his version of the Midnight Special. Quote, "My guitar's my life and my wife is the other half." End quote. Leadbelly's father, John Wesley Leadbetter, who was the son of slaves, made his way to Louisiana sometime after the Civil War. There, he started off by renting land, and by the end of the 1880s, he was courting one Sally Pugh. Then, on February 21st, 1888, Sally and Wes, as John was known, married in Shreveport. The couple were exceptionally hard workers who took to the fields alongside one another, a sense of hard work that would be passed on to their son. For a decade, they tried to start a family, though with little luck, and only had one child, a son, born in January of 1888, HoW William Leadbetter. Although HoW would later say that he was born on the 15th of January, he never said exactly where. In later years, questions would be raised regarding whether or not he was actually born across the state line in Lay, Texas, or in Louisiana. Though Texans like to take credit for Texas being the birth state of Leadbelly, both the 1900 and the 1910 census clearly state his birthplace being Louisiana. Now, Sally and Wes Leadbetter must have had a strong sense of family because both wanted more children, but for whatever reason unknown, they could not have them. They were middle-aged for their time period when HoW was born. Wes was 33 and Sally was 35. Around 14 years after HoW had come along, which was about 1902, they adopted a girl which they named Australia Carr Leadbetter. Being an only child for the first 14 years of his life, HoW was doted and more often than not spoiled. "No, sir, my papa and mama was too fine to me," he would later tell. "They never touched me to whoop me." HoW remained in school until age 14 before he dropped out and began working on his father's farm and neighboring farms. In a time when over a third of African Americans in his county were illiterate, it is remarkable that HoW went to school as long as he did. He not only gained literacy, but his later letters and correspondence demonstrated a clear ability to read and write adeptly. Now, getting back to that tangled situation mentioned in the intro and the four men on their way to that dance, Eric Griffin, Lee Brown, and of course, the two at the center of the storm, HoW and Will Stafford. Now there they were, making their way through a narrow dirt path with swamps on either side, headed towards the Red River Bottoms. Now the talk gets a bit ugly and quickly escalates out of control, with HoW and Will laying hands on one another. Now, HoW's relationship with guns goes way back to age 16. By then, he was also gaining a reputation for being a talented guitar player and singer, making him in high demand for what they called suki jumps, which were dances or parties in slave quarters and house parties. Unfortunately, this attention came with some consequences, none the least because of his thirst for women, which led him stumbling home more than a few nights, bleeding from cuts and bruises. Now, naturally, this didn't go unnoticed by his father, who gave him a typical coming-of-age present soon thereafter, a pistol. Years later, he would recall his father's exact words when Papa handed him the weapon. "My son, don't bother nobody. Don't make no trouble. But if somebody try to meddle with you, I want you to protect yourself." This pistol would bring him confidence as well as trouble, none the least back on the dirt road in the middle of his altercation with Will Stafford. He most likely reached for his pistol during the melee, and within seconds, Will Stafford was rolling down the side of the road and into the swamp. By the time he stopped rolling, Will was dead, and two of the three men still breathing immediately fled the scene. The crime wasn't reported until the next morning when Stafford's body was found by a group of children. The case fell on Sheriff Jim Baker, who paid a visit to Eric Griffin soon thereafter. The police evidently concluded that Griffin's version of what happened was the only version they needed. Thus, Huddy was found on the evening of the 18th of December and arrested. In chains, he was transported to DeKalb Holding Jail by wagon. Unbeknownst to authorities, Leadbelly was already on the run as a felon from a few towns over and had taken on the name Walter Boyd to evade capture. But now the man known as Walter Boyd was placed in Bowie County Jail and charged with murder and assault to murder. There he would remain for a long 6 months while the legal system slowly got their matters in order. During his time on the run, Leadbelly had not been able to play and sing as much as he wanted to. Walter Boyd could play and sing at times, sure, but if he wanted to stay clear from being recognized, he couldn't bring forth his full Leadbelly talents. He missed that a lot. Now, regarding his talent, even as a boy, he showed immediate promise when it came to music, and whenever instruments came his way, he displayed an aptitude for all of them: harmonica, piano, harp, even an old reed organ at the Shiloh Church. Now, as his talents improved, he would be asked to play country dances with what soon became his main instrument, his windjammer accordion. He would mount his pony, hook the windjammer to the saddle horn, and ride far into the countryside to do his thing. Now, it is concluded that he most likely got his first guitar, a 6-string guitar, mind you, in 1903, around the same time that the guitar was experiencing a rise in popularity in the rural South. Companies like Gibson and the new mail-order house of Sears Roebuck began to manufacture inexpensive guitars. Then, most likely around 1910, when he was living in Dallas, is when he acquired his first 12-string guitar. It was love at first sight when he saw an old 12-string Stella in a Dallas store window. The year before, he had heard a man play a similar one. It was a traveling medicine show where they sold a cure-all for 50 cents a bottle. He was captivated by the loud, ringing sound of the instrument and spent the rest of the night hanging around the medicine show tent listening to the man play that 12-string. So when he finally saw one on sale, he knew he had to have it. It cost $12, which is about $400 today. Not a bad price, I guess, for a decent guitar. So that same week, after laying his eyes on that coveted guitar, he approached a local farmer who knew of his cotton-picking talents, which were known far and wide, and was immediately hired. The going wage at the time was $5 for every 1,000 pounds of cotton picked. Wow! Well, within the week, he was able to return to the store and buy his first Stella 12-string guitar. One of the first songs he wrote on his newfound treasure was an adaptation of a lilting waltz he liked to call Irene, which would also be known as Irene Goodnight. According to family, he was singing this song as early as 1908 to his 7-month-old niece, Irene Campbell, which may be well and true, but it is also a fact that the song finally came together when he got his hands on that Stella guitar. Being afraid, desperate, and strong can prove to be a powerful combination. Shortly after being incarcerated, he broke out by overpowering the jailer, taking his weapon from him and fleeing into the countryside. His freedom lasted for 3 days before he was recaptured and returned to the jail. Then, on January 29, 1918, the grand jury of Bowie County indicted Walter Boyd, accusing him of killing Will Stafford by shooting him with a gun. There was also another charge that the district attorney Carney filed, one count of assault to murder. This charge apparently refers to an assault he made on either Brown or Griffin the same night of the incident. He pled guilty to both charges as fighting for real justice in a day and age when blacks were seen as inferiors seemed pointless. Later, Huddy would say that the fight initially began between Eric Griffin and Will Stafford and that he was pulled into the fight. One of his first cousins also explained that the reason Huddy stuck around after Stafford was killed and the other men fled the scene was because of the friendship between Huddy and Will. Accordingly, one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence against Huddy was an imprint from a tennis shoe. Now, his cousin claims that all 4 men were wearing duplicate shoes that night and that there was no real evidence to pin the murder on Huddy. It seemed like the easy way out to just get the story from the first man they found who'd been at the scene and take it from there, pinning the murder on whomever that first witness claimed was the shooter. However, in a later ambiguous comment, Huddy commented on how Stafford never should have crossed him. Whether he was referring to self-defense or murder remains unknown. After 2 trials, on April 22, 1918, Huddy was found guilty and wound up facing a minimum of 7 years and a maximum of 30 years in the notorious Texas penal system. After 1 year at Shaw State Prison Farm, he found it too difficult to accept his imprisonment. Consequently, on August 15, 1919, he escaped with a fellow convict. The co-escapee lacked Huddy's physical stamina and soon fell behind and was captured. But Huddy pressed on until the next morning, when he was awoken by a pack of growling tracking dogs. By that point in time, he was by a lake near Red River, and instead of listening to the officers' threats about going back with them willingly or getting shot, he turned his back on the police and walked into the water. He had no intention of returning to Shaw State Prison, so when a dog came into the water after him, he grabbed hold of it and drowned it in the lake. He then proceeded, intent on drowning himself, just like he had drowned the dog. In the end, several men were forced to wade into the water and yanked him out. The men put him on a wagon, and all of them slowly made their way back to the prison farm. After returning to the prison yard, his immediate supervisor, one Captain Francis, kept him out of the field for a week, allowing him to get some much-needed rest. Resting, in turn, allowed him to reflect, and he concluded that as important as freedom was, survival was even more so. He then decided going forward he would live by a new plan, one which entailed becoming a so-called rollin' son of a bitch, which meant becoming the hardest working man in the Texas prison system. He soon became the leader of a hoeing squad on the lead row. His days of trying to escape, to evade the system, were over. He remained at the Shaw State Farm for nearly 2 years, and Captain Francis grew to respect him enough to formally ask that the Board of Pardons clear his record of the escape charge. But just as his life was settling into a somewhat tolerable routine, he was uprooted once again when he was transferred to the Central State Farm, located to the southwest of Houston, a place known to most simply as Sugarland. When he arrived at Sugarland, he was 32 years old. He was used to hard work and brutal conditions. He was as strong, tough, big, and fit as any man in prison. However, that routine at Sugarland was a challenge even to him, in particular under the heavy July and August Texas sun. Nevertheless, he persevered. His relationship with his wife, Letty, had been strained even before his conviction, and now the emotional distance between them grew even greater. It was hard enough to be married to a convict when he was in Shaw State Farm, but now that he was more than 300 miles away, it proved impossible to uphold the relationship. He later sang that when he left his wife for prison, he would probably never no more see her, and she should do the best she could. Apparently, Letty took him at his word, and their marriage totally disintegrated, though there is no evidence that they ever formally divorced. The move to Sugar Land also proved difficult on his parents. Wes and Sally Ledbetter were in their 60s by this time, and a life of hard work had taken its toll on them. Still, Huddy was their beloved son, and about 2 years after he arrived in Sugar Land, Wes appeared at the main gate, asking to see the manager, one Captain Flanagan. And Wes had managed to get his hands on some more money, which he presented to Flanagan in hopes that it would be enough for his son to be let go. And Papa Wes told Flanagan that Huddy was his only male child and that he was desperately needed to work on the farm. Flanagan stared back at the old man with a mixture of wonder and sadness. Whether he wanted to take the bribe or not was irrelevant. It was simply not how business was done anymore. And Wes paid a visit to Huddy later that day before he left to return to Mooringsport to share the bad news with his wife. At the end of their conversation, Wes told his son that he didn't think he'd ever see him again. 4 months later, Huddy learned that his father had died. What quite possibly kept him going during these bad times was his playing. Both the inmates and the overseers soon recognized his superb musicianship and entertainment capability to bring a spark of life to the long, dreary weeks. Soon, Captain Flanagan was letting him travel around unguarded to other camps on the farm every Sunday, where he would entertain the men with songs and spring yarns. Now, concerning the name Leadbelly, it seems to go back to as early as 1912 when he got his first 12-string Stella guitar, but it is also likely that the name was solidified during his prison years in Sugar Land. Leadbelly himself said that nicknames in Sugar Land were of great importance, stating that anyone without a nickname was basically a nobody. According to him, it was the chaplain of the prison, the Reverend Sin Killer Griffin, who told him that he was a hard-driving man. He told him that instead of guts, he had lead in his belly. Well, Leadbelly seemed to like the nickname and began using it enthusiastically. Sin Killer Griffin. Wow, what a name. Of all the songs he learned at Sugar Land, by far the most popular was The Midnight Special. Though he didn't write all of the song, he added elements to it to make it his own, and after some time singing it, he came up with a fairly stable set of verses for his version. This included the parts where he sings about "Yonder comes Miss Rosie," "Get up in the morning," "Better walk right," "Jumpin' Judy," and a final quatrain in which he begins to worry about "my great long time yet to serve." The title of the song is in reference to a Southern Pacific train that left Houston every night a few minutes after 11 for San Antonio. As it rolled westward and entered Fort Bend County about 25 miles from downtown Houston, it crossed the Brazos River bottomland and passed some of the buildings of the prison farm. The train lights would light up the sorrow-filled cells and its inhabitants. The inmates came to nickname the train The Midnight Special, and it soon became a symbol for freedom as well as a harrowing reminder of life outside of Sugar Land. Soon, the inmates added verses about prison life and about local incidents concerning the Houston police, including Bud Russell, the transfer man who had taken Huddy down to Sugar Land. During this time, circa 1923 and 1924, it was Pat M. Neff from Waco who was the governor of Texas. Neff had campaigned in 1920 on a law and order platform that specifically promised no more pardons. Remaining true to his word, during his 4 years as governor, he pardoned only 5 men. So, for a convicted felon in Sugar Land, chances for relief did not look good. But then, circa January 1924, Governor Neff decided to begin a tour of the various prison camps around Texas. And one day he and his wife and a group of other women arrived at Leadbelly's camp. As usual, Captain Flanagan called on Leadbelly to provide some evening entertainment. By this time, Leadbelly had become quite well known as a prison entertainer and was even being allowed to keep money he made as a result of his performing. Here was his best chance for an audience yet, and he eagerly seized it. He claimed that he kept some white suits creased up and everything, ready for special occasions such as these. So along with a piano player and a bass player, he played Midnight Special. Following that number, he and the governor began talking. The ladies his wife had brought also joined in on the conversation, and things got so casual and festive that he was poured a glass of whiskey alongside the governor. Then he and the fellas began to jam some more. Leadbelly was making up lyrics on the fly, including passages from the Bible, particularly those having to do with forgiveness. Well, without making any reference to his crime or his guilt or innocence, he nevertheless managed to build an entire song on sentiment by explaining how hard parting from his wife had been and how everybody would be happy if he could make his way back home. FYI, the lyrics weren't all true to fact. For instance, the date of his judgment was not exactly right, but hey, he needed a rhyme. His wife Letty was renamed Mary, the name of his prison girlfriend. It had more of a Christian ring to it, one could say. Despite a few historical inaccuracies in the pardon song, Governor Neff was delighted at this instance of on-the-spot ballad-making and with HoW, Leadbelly, in general. Leadbelly later said that the governor told him that he was going to turn him loose after a while, but that he first was going to keep him there so he could pick and dance for him whenever he came down to the prison farm. He thanked the governor and remained in the farm. He knew that the governor only had 1 whole year to serve before his term was over, but hoped that Neff would keep his word. During this period, Neff came back several times to visit the farm and HoW. Then, after one particularly good performance, weeks passed with no word from Neff. It was starting to look like another cruel hoax, and his friends began to make fun of him about his optimism for an early release. Then finally, on January 16, 1925, in one of his last acts in office, Neff signed a full pardon for HoW, a.k.a. Leadbelly, as Walter Boyd. The prisoner, it read, had served 6 years, 7 months, and 8 days of his sentence, which was to last from 7 to 30 years. It's quite obvious that Neff, being fascinated by HoW and his musical talents, did not want to leave his governor's chair, being one who backtracked on his word about granting pardons. Ironically, and quite deserved, Governor Neff's pardoning of HoW at the tail end of his tenure was to be the act for which history best remembers him. HoW got the news one morning from Captain Flanagan, who told him that he was a free man, that his plea had indeed finally worked. So filled with optimism for his future and understanding the strength that music held, now more than ever, he packed up his few belongings, the money he had made during his time in prison, and walked out the prison gates, headed for Houston. Whew! What a story. Part 2, anyone? Stay tuned to House of Words. Only time will tell. So, let us end this episode with a few words from a man who undoubtedly possessed that it factor. If you ever go to Houston, oh, you better walk right, and you better not swallow, and you better not fight Chef Rock or will arrest you. Eddie Boone will take you down. You can bet your bottom dollar, penitentiary bound. End verse. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I've been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/houseofwords or paypal.me/houseofwordspodcast. Alternatively, you can subscribe and encourage others to subscribe to our YouTube page at House of Words Podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages. House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez. Narrated and written by me, Jason Nemore Harden. And music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.